Many could not fully comprehend why their captors had shown restraint. Some attributed it to individual kindness, others saw it as a collective American temperament. Yet their testimonies share one refrain, that being treated with respect forced them to confront what their own nation had become. In that mirror, the moral difference between systems stood naked. Historians tracing those transitions discovered that the American military's discipline in handling female POWs also reshaped gender perceptions within its own ranks. The decision to employ female officers as interrogators and administrators had begun as necessity. Too many male soldiers, too few trained staff, but soon proved transformative. Their presence moderated behavior, diffused aggression, and modeled professionalism. In later conflicts from Korea to Iraq, the precedent of female civil affairs, officers would trace its lineage back to the makeshift compounds of 1945. Compassion had operational value. The respect extended to the German women was not universal or perfect. Records confirm instances of misconduct, swiftly punished but never erased. Yet even those failures underscored the difference between policy and instinct. The institution itself demanded accountability, and that expectation distinguished it from the authoritarian systems it had defeated. The Americans understood that victory was meaningless if it reproduced the enemy's methods. Every tribunal, every reprimand reinforced that lesson. As Reconstruction accelerated, former prisoners merged quietly into the civilian population. Many never spoke of their wartime roles again. Some married Allied soldiers. Others returned to families that regarded them with suspicion. Yet a few corresponded with their former guards, exchanging cautious letters that spoke less of romance than recognition. "You taught me what uniform should mean," one woman wrote to a captain in 1946. "Not fear, but responsibility." The letter survived in his estate, folded beside campaign medals and photographs of ruined towns. The long-term psychological effects extended far beyond individuals. Sociologists examining post-war German identity noted that interactions with occupying troops, especially those marked by fairness, played a key role in dissolving the fatalism that Nazism had cultivated. To be defeated yet treated humanely challenged the entire narrative of racial destiny. The experience of the captured women, though rarely publicized, symbolized that inversion most sharply. Those once commodified by the regime discovered autonomy under its enemies. Meanwhile, in Washington, policy analysts codified the occupation's moral lessons into doctrine. Manuals for future campaigns included sections on civil-military relations and moral order maintenance. The technical precision that had powered tanks and bombers was now applied to empathy. Charts of prisoner rights, checklists for camp hygiene, procedures for grievance reporting. The same army that had industrialized destruction was learning to industrialize conscience. And at its root stood moments like Augsburg, the simple act of offering bread across barbed wire. As Europe stabilized, journalists began to revisit the moral contrasts of the war's aftermath. One correspondent wrote that America's greatest weapon was not the bomb, but the behavior of its soldiers. Photographs from the occupation show no grand gestures, only routines: a guard pouring coffee for a prisoner, a nurse adjusting a bandage, a chaplain reading quietly beside a cot. Yet within those routines lay the most radical idea of the modern age, that restraint could conquer more thoroughly than violence. The legacy persisted into the late 20th century, echoing through peacekeeping missions, humanitarian airlifts, and training academies where young officers studied the ethics of command. In those lectures, instructors often referenced Germany not for its battles but for its aftermath. The moral clarity achieved in 1945 became a compass for future generations, navigating the fog of asymmetric wars and civilian crises. The ghosts of Augsburg guided them still. For the surviving women, the memory aged differently. Some recalled the Americans' politeness as an unbearable kindness that exposed their own nation's cruelty. Others saw it as pragmatic control, yet all agreed it had preserved their sanity. A few decades later, one former prisoner, interviewed for a documentary, summarized the experience with a trembling voice. "We learned that power can protect without humiliating." Her words condensed the entire philosophy the occupation had proven in practice. By the time Germany rebuilt into a democracy, those moments of respect had woven themselves into its foundation. The generation that had once feared the Allies now modeled its institutions on them: courts, constitutions, police conduct. The mirror of captivity had become a template for governance. The women who had entered the camps as symbols of exploitation emerged, however quietly, as witnesses to the possibility of dignity after defeat. As the years faded, monuments rose to battles and generals, but none to those small acts of decency behind the wire. Yet perhaps that was fitting. Their power had always been in their invisibility, in the silent decision of a tired soldier to treat an enemy with grace, in the calculated choice of a commander to value order over revenge. History tends to honor thunder, but civilization is built in whispers, and so, when historians search the rubble of the 20th century for the line dividing barbarity from humanity, they often find it not in grand speeches or treaties, but in the quiet camps where respect replaced hatred. There, amid the echo of boots and the rustle of ration paper, the victors proved that mercy could be engineered, discipline could be compassionate, and war could, for a fleeting moment, teach peace. Because in the end, the truest conquest is not of land or ideology, but of the instinct to dehumanize. The American soldiers who guarded those women in 1945 won that victory without firing a shot.